In this section, we'll look at some of the larger trends in American culture during the 1970s, some of the winners and losers. Certainly, the economic problems that we mentioned in earlier videos affected the way Americans saw themselves. The stagflation affected the American psyche. Fewer people assumed that their children would do better than them economically. Now, that had been a characteristic of America for decades, but it was no longer. And fewer people had faith in institutions such as government or religion. Drugs continued to grow. As mentioned in the videos on the 1960s culture, the ugly cost of drugs began to become apparent in the early 1970s. There was a massive heroin epidemic in the early 1970s, and then by the later part of the decade, you begin to see more developed drug trade networks, especially in regard to cocaine. And you begin to see massive amounts of cocaine coming from Colombia and South America. And the prices began to drop and more people used it. More and more women poured into the labor force during the 1970s, and that, of course, had implications for the nature of the family. You begin to see more dual income families where both the father and the mother worked. And more Americans cohabitated outside of marriage. They lived together, but they weren't married. Younger adults tend to marry at later ages, and more people across America lived alone. The divorce rates grew for most of the decade, and fertility rates dropped for most of the decade before they stabilized in the late 1970s. Increasingly, unmarried women with children were the face of poverty. That was sort of what you think of when you think of American poverty in the 1970s. Suburbanization continued, especially in the New South, places like Dallas and Atlanta. And as the interstate systems, you begin to see more and more beltways around big towns, and the office parks grew. In the 70s were when you really see a rage for the enclosed shopping malls. And they spread around in all major cities in America, and they were sort of the place where people would congregate. Modernist architecture, which has sort of begun in the previous decades, really continued to evolve in the 1970s with even more flexible designs and freer designs. There's a real distinctive image of 1970s architecture you can see in some of these slides here. Things like shag carpets or floating or circular stairways and vaulted ceilings and sunken living rooms or stone walls and fireplaces. There were some remnants of hippie done, sort of some of the neon and bright colors and things like wicker furniture as well. When it came to institutional architecture, there was the Brutalist school, as it was called, was popular, and that sort of included a tremendous amount of use of concrete, and it was intended to appear serious, not light or comfortable. And you can see this often in some of the universities that were built during the 1970s, and some of the larger office buildings reflected some of this exposed concrete and the Brutalist school. In another trend that would grow in the 1980s, African Americans began for the very first time to return to the South. They had been a great migration of blacks from the rural South to the urban North in the previous decades, going all the way back to World War I. But in the 1970s and 1980s, you begin to see the reverse of that. More and more African Americans returning to the urban South. Black culture and society increasingly became two-tier, as affirmative action and other government policies during the 1970s lifted a third of blacks into the middle class. Another third fell deeper into poverty. The number of African Americans for the first time joined the growth of suburbs, and so some were left behind in the deteriorating inner cities, which had the poor schools and little opportunities. So it all sort of contributed to a two-tier society. As the interstate system spread and suburbanization continued, the inner cities continued to deteriorate. Now, at the same time, however, the 1970s began to see the roots of gentrification, especially later in the decade, and it really took off in the 1980s. Especially younger Americans began for the first time to return to the dilapidated inner cities and sort of fix them up. This trend for gentrification, as I say, grew in the 1980s and even in the 1990s. Throughout the 1970s, feminism in many ways continued to advance into the mainstream. There was a hit television sitcom, which you may be familiar with, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and it depicted a single woman who was in her 30s but was unmarried, and she was a professional supporting herself, and she wasn't lonely. She was happy and and celebrated her singledom, and she associated with a bunch of single, professional, and happy women in similar circumstances. In 1971, there was a sort of an anthem of the feminist movement when Helen Reddy sang a song, I Am Woman. And in the following year, Ms. Magazine began publication and did real well. In 1975, the United Nations declared the International Women's Year, and there were conferences around the country and indeed the world. The United States unveiled its first currency with a woman on it, the Susan B. Anthony dollar coin. And also, in 1972, there were the Education Act amendments, which included Title IX, and that required equal spending on both genders, male and female, in education. And that, by the way, included sports. And this had a tremendous impact in that it opened the door for more and more female athletics. Of course, feminism still had to fight to overcome traditional masculine world. You begin to see feminism growing, but there's sexism still prevalent as well. You see that in advertising in the 1970s, and the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders, which were created in the decade, sort of obviously were intended to appeal to the male audience. As also mentioned in the videos in the 1960s culture, there was a conservative backlash to all this cultural liberalism, and that continued to grow throughout the 1970s. An abortion became a real emotional cultural flashpoint, as did the final failure of the Equal Rights Amendment. It was up for ratification, and it ultimately failed. And that was a real controversial debate going on there. Anyway, influential in both these was the conservative family activist Phyllis Schlafly, and she started an organization called the Eagle Forum to fight for a conservative culture. In many respects, the cultural liberalism of the 1960s and the conservative reaction of the 1970s and 1980s laid the foundation for the cultural wars that continue to exist today. Perhaps you've heard of the term the cultural wars. Well, they kind of go back to this period. This concludes the video on sort of an overview of the 1970s culture, some of the trends of the decade.